Not so long after the release of Five Nights at Freddy's 4, I was discussing the game with a friend of mine. With 4's redesign of the gameplay, we were trying to determine the best way to get our mutual reluctant friend introduced to the franchise, and whether we should start with Five Nights at Freddy's 1 or Five Nights at Freddy's 4. Which led to the idea, which Five Nights at Freddy's is the best game? Well, strap yourselves in as we take a look at each game in the franchise and try and decide once and for all which Five Nights at Freddy's is the best game. Let's look at each in turn. But before we delve into the first game, there are some interesting facts about the game's development you may not know. Sure, you know about the game's creator, Scott Cawthon, that lovable scamp that now donates hundreds of thousands of dollars to charity and loves to troll poor old MatPat. But did you know that before Five Nights at Freddy's, Scott Cawthon was a remarkable failure in his development career? That's right, prior to developing our beloved franchise, Scott primarily was producing Christian games that were universally financial failures. In an interview with Geeks Under Grace, he even states that at a low point in his life, his health insurance was cancelled because he had mentioned suicidal thoughts to his doctor. Fortuitously, it was these previous game failures that led to his success. Before Five Nights at Freddy's 1 was released, Scott released the family-friendly game Chipper and Sons Lumber Co., which drew criticism for the creepy appearance of the characters that looked lifeless like scary animatronic animals. Jim Sterling is quoted as saying that the game was unintentionally terrifying. Further depressed by the poor reception to Chipper and Sons, Scott used this criticism to refocus his game. No longer trying to make something friendly and fun for the whole family, he decided to make it as scary as he could. After deciding on the name Five Nights at Freddy's and beginning the development process, Scott launched the Kickstarter for the game, with a goal of just $10,000. And how much did he receive for the now mega franchise? The Kickstarter brought in a staggering sum of $0. That's right, nothing. Even at this point, Scott was still a failure and depressed by the Kickstarter receiving no money. After 2 days, he cancelled this Kickstarter in June. Fortunately for us, Scott kept going. And on August 8th, Five Nights at Freddy's 1 was released on Desura, with its Steam release shortly thereafter. And then the magic began. Five Nights at Freddy's 1 had a unique take on horror, and this fresh approach was leaving people breathless and leaving their lights on at night. The simple design of Five Nights at Freddy's was a key to its success. The horror is all in the anticipation and unknown, with your imagination and childhood experiences filling in the game's blanks. This is the greatest strength of Five Nights at Freddy's 1. The game's simplicity allows you to jump in quickly. The fear and paranoia mounts quickly as you manage your power levels, always tempting to leave those doors closed a moment longer, using up more power and making you even more paranoid. Five Nights at Freddy's 1 is a masterpiece of simplicity, originality, fear, tension, and a definite contender for the top spot. Its only real weakness is that the story is somewhat lacking in comparison to the following games. There are no mini-games, no real hidden levels, and very little in the way of Easter eggs. This is likely a result of Five Nights at Freddy's 1 being a gamble for Scott, not knowing at this point if the game would be another in a long list of failures. And I won't be the only person here to say that I am very glad it was not. This was a watershed moment for Scott. It allowed him to realize his dreams and continue doing what he loves. Five Nights at Freddy's 1 is reported to have over 4,694 downloads a day, bringing in our no longer struggling game designer around $12,000 per day. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 was released on November 10th, 2014, a mere 3 months after its predecessor. While criticized for this fact, it was widely enjoyed by critics and gamers alike, as Scott ups the ante, and we are forced to face off with not only the withered animatronics, but 4 new toys. A music-loving marionette, shadows, and occasionally the naked Nate endoskeleton, and the insufferable Balloon Boy.
Hi!
While the traditional media may hate it when games are compared to film, there are some very similar escalations when it comes to the sequels. Think of the 1979 classic Alien and its sequel in 1986 Aliens. The first, somewhat relaxed, minimalist, and classically loved. The sequel, the stakes are raised, and things start to get crazy. This is how I would describe Five Nights at Freddy's 2. as the second Alien film to Five Nights at Freddy's Alien. Things are hectic, there is a lot more to keep track of, and it almost overwhelms the fear factor. Keeping track of around 10 animatronics is, in my opinion, for it, a little bit too much for it to have the simple immersion of the first game. And mechanically there is very little deviation from the first game. Sure, you have no doors and you have to wind the clock, but to me it always seemed to be a little bit overdone, and the game comes down to a simple repetition. It didn't share Five Nights at Freddy's 1 less is more approach. While mechanically I think that Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is my least favourite in terms of gameplay, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is where the lore started to ramp up. For the first time we had minigames and secrets to uncover, and the rumour mill started to explode with theories and speculation. It may seem strange now, but at this point in the game's timeline, there was still even people arguing over whether it was a sequel or a prequel. Of course, it is obviously a prequel to the first game. To really play Five Nights at Freddy's 2, you can't just jump in. It requires you to play the first game, and because of this, I would not rank it the best in the series. Mechanically, it is weak, but is still strong in story development, and a must-play in understanding the plot of the series. Jumping forward in time to the 2nd of March 2015, we arrive at Fredbear's Fright. No longer taking place in the restaurant, we are now the security guard of a haunted attraction based on the Fazbear Pizzeria. Five Nights at Freddy's 3 is likely to be the most controversial in terms of popularity, and the mixed reviews it received reflects this. While beating Five Nights at Freddy's 2 was largely dependent on learning patterns, Five Nights at Freddy's 3 returns to the less is more approach of Five Nights at Freddy's 1. Interestingly, if we look again at the comparison to the Aliens franchise, both Aliens 3 and Five Nights at Freddy's 3 have a darker tone and less antagonists than their respective predecessors. While Five Nights at Freddy's 3 may be one of the most unpopular, I believe that in the terms of mechanics, tone and story, it is one of my favourites. Five Nights at Freddy's 3 addition to the story answered a lot of questions, and its use of minigames hidden inside minigames made for an amazing experience in trying to unravel the mysteries of the story. Adding Springtrap to the cast of animatronics was a fresh addition, and the mind games Scott added to this game were the designs of a mastermind. The only thing that shocked me more than some of the ways you unravel a story is that people were even able to figure them out. The only real issue I have with this game is it feels disconnected in the timeline. Taking place well after the first game, and out of the restaurant with none of the original Fazbear 4 to attack you, leaves us feeling more like a spin-off with some story flashbacks more than anything else. And the last game, Five Nights at Freddy's 4. Slated to be released on October 31st for Halloween, Scott, the master of mind games and surprises, could wait no longer and went ahead and released the game on July 23rd, promising to add content later in the year on Halloween. Five Nights at Freddy's 4 is without a doubt the most unique in the series. Switching out the idea of being a security guard and checking cameras, you're now a small child hiding from nightmares. The clever use of animation, such as looking down at the floor while running, adds to the tension and the fear of the unknown. Perhaps the most amazing aspect of this game was the switch from visual to audio being your most important tool for completing the game. Listening for breathing and trying to determine which side you'll be ambushed from makes for a very visceral experience. Oftentimes on later nights, I would close my eyes to better hear. With my eyes closed, my imagination got to work, filling in those blanks with the worst your subconscious can dream up. This reaction surprised me in its genius, as closing your eyes to listen for monsters is exactly what a child would do. Intentional design or not, Scott struck a goldmine here that resonated with many fans. While some understanding of the previous games is useful for Five Nights at Freddy's 4, this game is the first game since the original that you can jump in and play as someone new to the series. And while discussing this with my friend, we spent a lot of time on this fact. If we introduce someone new, would we show them 1 or 4? The combination of new direction, audio clues, animation quality, all from the child's perspective make Five Nights at Freddy's 4 contender for one of the best games in the series, in my mind. The only major criticism I have for this game is trying to fit the minigames into the story, which has given myself and many others countless hours of frustration. So now to the judging. This is quite subjective and largely my opinion. If you disagree with me, let me know how you would rank the 4 games. But with that said, let's decide which game is the best. Maybe coming as no surprise, my least favourite, and at rank 4, I believe, is Five Nights at Freddy's 2. the weakest in the games. It almost seems like an expansion to the first game more than its own standalone, with very little in the way of gameplay changing, and playing it without having played the first would not leave much of an impression. For third place, ironically enough, I'd place Five Nights at Freddy's 3. While this is the game that mechanically I found very satisfying and enjoyable, it was not quite as fear-inducing as the first, or as unique as the fourth. So now the runner-up. Will it be the first or the fourth? Fredbear vs Fazbear. This to me is an incredibly hard decision. It's hard to beat the charm and nostalgia of the first game, with its simplistic design that reached that deep uncanny valley we experience when seeing the animatronics for the first time. But then again, the fourth game animation and sound quality is nothing to scoff at. Coming in second place we have Five Nights at Freddy's 4. While an amazing game and one of my favourite Five Nights at Freddy's experiences, for me personally I find the design of the nightmares a little bit over the top. All the teeth and decay in the models just does not really appeal to me, and for this setting I think it would have been better to use a similar design to the original Fazbear 4. Which means of course that taking a #1 spot for best game in the series is, you guessed it, Five Nights at Freddy's 1, the original, the classic. It's hard to replicate that first feeling of playing Five Nights at Freddy's 1. Perhaps the other games suffer from coming after such an experience. Five Nights at Freddy's 1 was really the first of its kind, and showed us how a simple less is more design to horror games could become one of the most popular scary games out there, and you do not need the biggest budget or longest story to scare your players. With this decided upon, I'll definitely be using this game to introduce my timid friend to the wonderful world of Fazbear's entertainment. So how accurate do you think my list is? Do you agree with the list from 1 to 4? In the question of best Five Nights at Freddy's game, have you your own idea? Well, let me know in the comments, where is it? Above? Yeah, let me know in the comments above. Until next time, my name's Gavin, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.